stand as heroes, but in fact are our destroyers, operating behind the shadows of a grand scheme larger than the destruction they themselves conceive. The goal is imperial domination, and only few have risen against them. The goal is total control in a situation where their own cause is defeating them.
The world, stock prices fell like
the goal
dominoes.
Comes from no nation, but an outside force that has taken them hostage. Who their players are, we must know now if we are to defeat them. Yet the question remains, will we do so in time, before it becomes too late for yourselves, for your family, your children, and civilization? This is the true story of Syria.
Well, when we went to Syria, it was sometime in October, and the situation was getting very tense there. So our flight arrived at around 3 in the morning. So you can imagine the surprise and the shock of the security forces when 3 foreign journalists arrived at a time when there was a media ban. It's an international journalist there.
Well, we're here in the center of the Syrian capital. You can see behind me, traffic is just about starting to flow again. But
going into the city, Damascus was rather peaceful. It was quiet, although very tense still, because everybody knows what was going on in the country. And what's interesting, I think, mostly for us, is that we saw the kind of diverse opinions on what was going on. There was no clear 2 sides even. There were more than 2 sides. It was not, I want the regime or I don't want the regime. And there was one time we were interviewing a young man, and he was rather critical of the government, so he gave his point of view. And what you didn't see on the camera is that there was a group of men around him and us listening to what he was saying. And afterwards, after the interview was finished, they all came up to us and said, "Get us on camera, we want to say what we feel." And then we also spoke to those people who were protesting, specifically those who were on the streets in Harasta. That's about 20 minutes outside of Damascus. One of the guys that we interviewed, he actually disappeared for 2 days, and he said he was held by security forces, he was beaten up.
After 48 hours of detention and torture, they took all of my money and belongings and threw me out into the street.
We also spoke with soldiers' families, those who had been killed. And you can also feel that they are angry at the protesters because their sons have been lost, their fathers have been lost, husbands have been lost, and you can understand the point of view that they're coming from.
How can soldiers kill other soldiers? This is impossible. Whatever media says this is plainly lying.
Speaking about fear, okay, I'll tell you one incident. We were supposed to interview one of the leaders of the National Coordination Council, the local opposition. The interview was set, and when we called him, he said, "I might have to cancel because there were security forces, we think, who were at the office, and they wrote some threats on the wall." We had our fixer who translated what it meant. It said, "You're working for Israel in the US. We're going to kill you." And so they were direct threats at the members of the NCC, particularly the leader. That was a scary time because they were just outside. We didn't know whether they would come in. And we asked our interviewee, "Are you scared?" And he said, "You only die once." So the Syrians are very, I felt, hospitable people, but when it comes to political talk, when it comes to expressing a political view in a crowd, it can really get heated. They would jostle at the rally that we went to, it got pretty rough. Our camera was broken at some point. And, you know, but that is your job. You go in there, you try to do what you can. You try to film as much as you can, try to put it in as much context. And we had to sometimes tell people, please calm down. Otherwise, we can't get anything on film.
We're here in the center of the Syrian capital where thousands have gathered to show their support for the government. Now, this is a far cry from the images we've been seeing in other cities in the country where there have been reported clashes between security forces and anti-government protesters. However, one thing is clear, though, no matter where in this country.
Whenever there'd be news about Syria, or whenever we would be airing news about Syria, I would really pay attention and bother everybody here and say, I don't think that's correct, I don't think that's not as precise as I think it was. So I'd like to think that because of my trip there and my experience there, that when I see something about Syria, I don't take it at face value. I remember everything that I'd gathered and would look through it through that perspective rather than just what I see.
Overseas now to Syria, which today saw one of the largest demonstrations there in months. It's been a year of uprisings and violent crackdowns across the region, but the crisis in Syria continues without let-up, and today dozens more were killed. NBC's Ayman Mohyeddin is in neighboring Jordan and has our report.
9 months into the Syrian uprising, hundreds of thousands of Syrians took to the streets today, protesting a regime that shows no signs of backing down. In this year of the Arab Spring, a wave of change that toppled Hosni Mubarak of Egypt and Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, Bashar al-Assad of Syria has so far managed to hold on to power. The cost, more than 5,000 lives since March, with more killed each day, even as many soldiers defect, and the uprising lurches towards civil war. Nothing has slowed down the carnage, not even the presence of Arab League observers. Their job to ensure the Assad regime's compliance with an agreement aimed at ending the crackdown.
أيها الإخوة المسلمون في كل مكان، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته وبعد. أتوجه برسالة اليوم لأهلنا في شام الرباط والجهاد والعزة والعروبة والكرامة، شام الانتفاض على الذل، شام التصدي للظلم والظالمين، شام التضحية والفداء، شام الرفعة والإباء. فأقول لهم: سلام عليكم أيها الأحبة الأبطال، سلام عليكم أيها المجاهدون الآمرون بالمعروف والناهون عن المنكر، سلام عليكم أيها المظلومون.
Today, the government of Libya announced the death of Muammar Gaddafi. This marks the end of a long and painful chapter for the people of Libya. You have won your revolution, and now we will be a partner as you forge a future that provides dignity, freedom, and opportunity.
قولوا له بل أنت زعيم عصابة المجرمين، قولوا له لقد مضى عهد الإذلال وولى زمن الخداع.
I am confident that Assad's days are numbered.
The world will not waver. Assad must go.
We both agree that Assad needs to go.
It is just further evidence that Assad has to go.
He is no longer legitimate and that he needs to go.
For the sake of the Syrian people, the time has come for him to step aside.
Assad is on his way out. We all need to be thinking about the day after Assad.
Assad has lost all legitimacy, that his time has passed.
President al-Assad has lost legitimacy, that he needs to step down.
As I have said many times before, Assad has lost all legitimacy, and Assad must go.
Assad will leave power.
Assad is standing in their way.
And everyone can speculate about what that would mean for President Assad. But the election.
The Syrian regime is estimated by the UN to have killed 2,500 of its own people during the past 6 months of protests. But President Bashar al-Assad is unlikely to face the same UN-endorsed military action or the level of sanctions that helped rid Libya of its dictator Muammar Gaddafi. And for that, Assad can thank Russia. According to Moscow correspondent Norman Hermont, the Arab Spring has cost Moscow crucial Middle East allies, and it's determined to hold on to its influence in Syria.
The crowds in the street are still protesting, and Russia's flag, along with China's, is being burned for its stubborn support of Syria's regime, despite a government crackdown that has killed thousands. But Russia's president says Moscow has no plans to back sanctions against Syria, a long-time Mideast ally. We must not idealize this situation, says Dmitry Medvedev. We must approach it from a balance of strongest interest. Russia's interest in Syria has everything to do with arms. It hopes to sell Damascus new fighter jets, missile systems, and artillery. In all, about $4 billion worth of contracts. Moscow is not about to lose another Mideast customer, says this analyst, without a fight.
All other countries, they are not our kind of clients. They are clients of the United States, France, Britain. And if Syria also will follow, we will lose almost all our clients in the Middle East.
The Arab Spring has not been good to Russia. Its ties to Muammar Gaddafi go back decades, and Moscow only reluctantly recognized Libya's new government. It was the 73rd country to do so. That may put billions of dollars of construction and oil contracts at risk. Now, many say, the same scenario is playing out in Syria, where Russia has billions invested and a major naval base.
Russia has a lot to lose in Syria, and that is why Russia wants to find out the less destabilizing way out of the situation.
More than anything, the Kremlin wants to be seen as standing by Syria.
We begin tonight with an important story, details of which may sound very familiar to a lot of Americans given our history over the past few years in places like Iraq. Tonight, Pentagon sources are telling NBC News Syria is preparing chemical weapons for their possible use against the Syrian people in the form of aerial bombs. It's believed this specific intelligence is the reason why President Obama took a hard line against Syria just a few days ago, warning them there would be consequences if these weapons were used. Let's begin here tonight with the very latest on what we know, starting with our Pentagon correspondent, Jim Miklaszewski. Jim, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. U.S. officials tell us that the Syrian military is poised tonight to use chemical weapons against its own people. And all it would take is the final order from Syrian President Assad. As the fighting grows more intense and Syrian rebels close in on Damascus, the Syrian regime has turned increasingly desperate. U.S. officials tell NBC News the Syrian military has now loaded the precursor chemicals for sarin nerve gas into aerial bombs that could be dropped from dozens of Syrian fighter bombers. This week, U.S. intelligence detected a flurry of activity at chemical weapons sites, like this one, the Furcluse Weapons Depot near Homs. Today, while U.S. officials confirm the precursor chemicals are loaded, they must still be mixed together to create the deadly sarin gas. The alarming development shook the world. President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton issued strong warnings to Syria's President Assad that there would be serious consequences if he used chemical weapons.
Almost 3 weeks ago in Syria, more than 1,000 innocent people, including hundreds of children, were murdered in the worst chemical weapons attack of the 21st century. And the United States has presented a powerful case to the world that the Syrian government was responsible for this horrific attack on its own people. This was not only a direct attack on human dignity, it's a serious threat to our national security. There's a reason governments representing 98% of the world's people have agreed to ban the use of chemical weapons. Not only because they cause death and destruction in the most indiscriminate and inhumane way possible, but because they can also fall into the hands of terrorist groups who wish to do us harm. That's why last weekend I announced that, as Commander-in-Chief, I decided that the United States should take military action against the Syrian regime. This would not be another Iraq or Afghanistan. there would be no American boots on the ground. Any action we take would be limited, both in time and scope.
A few months ago, the world was on the verge of World War III, Armageddon, after Barack Obama announced that he would bomb Syrian President Bashar al-Assad into oblivion for dropping a chemical weapon on his own people. Syrian allies Russia, China, and Iran vowed that they would retaliate if Syria was attacked, stating that there was zero evidence that al-Assad was behind the attack, that it was more than likely Obama's al-Qaeda-linked rebels who were responsible. Obama went on to state that he had incontrovertible evidence that al-Assad was behind the attack, that it was quote-unquote preposterous to believe that anyone but al-Assad was behind it, that his quote-unquote surgical strike on Syria would be short and sweet, lasting only a few days, that he absolutely would not put boots on the ground, and for this reason, like the Libyan war, he would not seek approval from Congress for engaging in the attack. But the basis for an attack against Syria was all based on a lie. Actually, several lies. According to Pulitzer-winning author Seymour Hersh, citing high-level Pentagon and intelligence sources along with top-secret documents, President Barack Obama lied about the chemical weapons attack, that it was actually the al-Qaeda-linked rebel group al-Nusra, funded by Obama, trained by none other than our own CIA, and not al-Assad, who was behind the attack. That in fact Obama knew the days after the August 21st chemical weapons attack that it couldn't have been Bashar al-Assad who was behind the attack. But most damning of all, the Obama regime had intercepted thousands of radio communications of the Syrian military and cherry-picked and doctored them in their report to Congress and the American people to make it look like al-Assad was behind the attack. But it gets worse. Obama had every intention of putting American troops on the ground. It would have been Iraq all over again, a replay of Bush's phony WMDs. According to Hersh's sources, the military was preparing for a ground invasion to topple the al-Assad regime that would involve a staggering 70,000 U.S. troops. It was only the Joint Chiefs of Staff, led by General Martin Dempsey, who put a stop to Obama's madness, along with the American people who refused to fight another one of Obama's unconstitutional wars. Dempsey estimated that to topple the Assad regime, it would take months, if not years, hundreds of aircraft, ships, and submarines, along with the thousands of U.S. troops to carry it out. In other words, a full-scale war with America on one side and Syria, Iran, Russia, and China on the other side.
I am personally shocked and horrified by the tragic incident in Hula 2 days ago, which took so many innocent lives, children, women, and men. This was an appalling crime, and the Security Council has rightly condemned it. And I extend my profound condolences and my heart.
The public mind has been drowned out by shouts from the Western sphere of influence, led by former British Prime Minister Tony Blair's doctrine of responsibility to protect, with complicity from the U.S. governments of George W. Bush, continued by President Barack Obama. Hoisting the flag of humanitarian intervention, the U.S., with obscure evidence provided by Tony Blair's British government in 2003, invaded Iraq. Similar allegations for protecting the people of foreign lands brought about the international military involvement in the war in Libya in 2011 and the Kosovo-Serbian fiasco during the late 1990s. In these cases, under shouts for annihilating a brutal dictatorial regime, which in fact most of them were, false evidence was provided, U.S. constitutional laws violated, all in the name of toppling dictatorial regimes under the auspices of protecting their civilians.
In the circumstances that we faced then, but I think even if you look back now, it was better to deal with this threat, to deal with it, to remove him from office, and I do genuinely believe that the world is safer as a result. I believe he threatened.
It is under this scope by which we are to examine what occurred in Hula, Syria, May 25th, 2012.
This particular tragedy has again drawn the attention of the world to what is happening in Syria.
Для нас совершенно не является главным, кто является во власти в Сирии, какой режим в Сирии. Главное для нас обеспечить прежде всего прекращение любого насилия.
But the urgent thing now is to try to get such a political process started under whatever terms can be agreed between Kofi Annan, the Assad regime, the relevant opposition forces in Syria. That is what we are all united about doing.
И когда некоторые наши партнеры, особенно из числа стран, которые расположены ближе к Сирии, чем Россия или Великобритания, начинают говорить, что только смена режима решит проблему, у меня возникает сомнение в искренности их заявлений о том, что они хотят прекратить насилие, помочь прекратить насилие.
In the wake of the Hula massacre, Russia, the strongest proponents for carrying out Kofi Annan's six-point peace plan since he was appointed UN Arab League peace envoy to Syria in late February, led a crucial battle during the weekend of the massacre to determine with conclusive evidence what had actually happened in the brutal events of May 25th. Russia called an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council 2 days later on a Sunday afternoon. The UNSC received a briefing from Norwegian General Robert Mood, head of the 200-plus UN observer mission deployed into Syria as part of the Annan peace plan, where he told members of the Permanent Security Council, plus a representative from Germany, that the evidence was, quote, murky as to who led the slaughter against civilians in Syria. But despite the general's caution that at the moment no conclusion can be made as to who was at fault, and with the Russians and a UNSC letter stating that an investigation is required, not a second passed from the adjournment of the UNSC closed-door meeting before the French, British, and German envoys raced to the microphones in the press area, concluding for the public Assad was undeniably to blame.
UN ambassadors went a step further to blame the Syrian government. From Germany,
there is a clear footprint of the government in this massacre.
The Council has issued a strong and united condemnation of the mass killings of civilians on the 25th of May in El Hula, including by artillery, shelling and tank fire from the Syrian regime.
That the Syrian government,
Russian Deputy Envoy Alexander Pankin was left to explain calmly to the media the true accounts delivered by General Mood, clarifying that the general had established evidence of tanks being present in Hula, a claim used by the British sphere of influence to say those were the footprints of the regime's involvement, but that Mood did not link tank shellings to the number of deaths. In fact, according to accounts, most of the over 100 massacres in Hula were killed at close range. Pankin then raised what the British faction of the West and Arab region wished would have remained unsaid. There is a third force terrorist or foreign intervention at play.
Yes, there is a third element, or there are third elements. And these people are not committed to the cause of the Syrian people. They are committed to their own agenda.
Herb Latsius made these remarks 4 days before Hula. However, hours before the atrocity, State Department spokesperson Victoria Nuland recalled the right to enforce Chapter 7, the the UN Security Council clause to invoke foreign military intervention by air, land, and sea in the event that Annan's plan proved to be a failure.
That it's time, the Secretary's made clear, it's going to be Chapter 7
At the same
next.
time, every day, dozens of people are getting killed.
Was it this third force Latius warned of days before the massacre who waged the massacre? How could we know? When the British and German envoys screamed Assad to the press before any investigation was allowed to take place. Assad screamed vociferously, drowning General Robert Mood's conclusion that the evidence was murky.
We would do that with our allies, bearing in mind, of course, what can be secured at the UN Security Council and what is practical and effective. So we're not ruling anything out, but a military intervention in Syria, as I've always pointed out, would have to be vastly greater in scale than was the case in Libya.
There seems to me to be only one other alternative. Members of the international community are left with the option only of having to consider whether they're prepared to take actions outside of the Annan Plan and the authority of this council.
Within 24 hours of Russia's emergency closed-door meeting, a Syrian rebel spokesman proclaimed that the massacre now justified the opposition's right to end their commitment to Annan's ceasefire, playing right into the hands of what had been the intent of the British with complicity of the U.S. Obama government before and after the atrocity, an end to Kofi Annan's peace plan. If an investigation would have led to the truth that Bashar al-Assad's regime indeed was to blame for the massacre, no investigation at the time was even allowed to be carried out to discover if it was true.
To reaffirm one of the oldest, one of the strongest alliances the world has ever.
A few days after the hideous bloodbath in the Syrian city of Hula, 11-year-old Ali al-Sayed suddenly became famous in the Arab media. When armed men invaded the house of his family in Hula and murdered all the members of his family in cold blood, little Ali also dropped to the ground. The blood of his dead mother, who lay next to him, colored his clothes red. This saved his life, because the murderers thought that Ali was also dead. It is striking that the 11-year-old Ali twice described the murderers of his family as men with shaved heads and long beards. This definitely does not fit the soldiers of the Syrian army, but rather points in the direction of...
According to eyewitness testimonies, the massacre happened during the time frame after the Friday prayers, when Sunni rebels attacked 3 Syrian army checkpoints around Hula. Despite the fact that Hula has a more than 90% Sunni population, almost exclusively families from the Alawi and Shia minorities in Hula were killed. Those killed include members of the Alawi family Shomalia and the family of a Sunni member of parliament, since he was considered as a government collaborator. Immediately after the massacre, the culprits filmed their victims, representing them as Sunni victims and distributing the videos on the internet.
Were the preferred targets of hidden terrorism by the armed resistance. Taxi drivers, street vendors, mailmen, especially civil functionaries, were innocent victims of acts that went from simple assassination to gratuitous barbarity. Their throats were slashed, mutilated, cut into pieces, thrown into street corners or public trash cans. These acts of atrocity were then exploited by the media to impute the responsibility to the government forces. We were taken by surprise ourselves by this tactic during a visit to Homs. A man had just been attacked by part of the armed gangs because he refused to close his shop. His car was blown up, and he was literally hacked to pieces and tossed under the storefront window. At the moment we were coming by, passers-by opened their mobile phones and were filming, and we overheard one of them say, doubtless talking to one of the satellite TV networks, "This is what Syrian citizens endure at the hands of Bashar al-Assad's death squads." We photographed this event. We then proceeded to take the body of this poor killed man to the hospital. Instead of bringing help to the murdered person, the onlookers filmed it, getting Al Jazeera to believe that the state had perpetrated the crime.
Обама упомянул об одной из угроз – это ИГИЛ. Ну а кто помогал вооружать людей, которые в Сирии боролись с Асадом-то? Кто создавал благоприятный политический информационный климат? Кто подталкивал к поставкам оружия? А вы чего, разве вы не понимаете, кто там воюет? Там воюют наемники. В основном. Вы знаете, что там платят деньги? И они воюют там, где платят больше. Вот они вооружились, им платят определенную сумму. Мне даже называли эти суммы, которые им платят. Они там воюют уже с оружием, все, у них уже не отнимешь. Потом выяснилось, что в другом месте чуть-чуть начали побольше платить. Они там туда перетекут. Вот они захватили месторождения нефтяные, там, скажем, где-то в Ираке или в Сирии. Нефть начали добывать. У них эту нефть покупают, транспортируют, продают. Почему санкции не накладывают на всех, кто это делает? А что, разве Соединенные Штаты не знают, кто это делает? Это разве не их союзники этим занимаются? У них что, нет силы, возможности повлиять на своих союзников? Или они не хотят влиять? Зачем они бомбят ИГИЛ? Вот там начали нефть добывать и больше платить. И там часть сразу этих боевиков перетекла из так называемой цивилизованной оппозиции. Сразу же перетекла в ИГИЛ, потому что там больше платят. Я считаю, что это...
Saudi Arabia and other Persian Gulf monarchies and emirates provide an estimated $500 billion a year to radical Salafi networks, including the various Al-Qaeda groupings that are engaged in violent destabilizations, including the ongoing armed rebel operations in Syria. In recent weeks, these funds have facilitated a flow of weapons and paid foreign mercenaries into Syria via bordering countries, including Iraq, Lebanon, and Turkey. The concentration of black market weapons along the Syrian borders is unprecedented. Arms traffickers are becoming millionaires overnight. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states are bankrolling the recruitment, arming, and deployment of Sunni mercenaries who are being sent into Syria to fight against the Assad government and the Syrian security forces.
Experts have little confidence the Arab League and United Nations peace plan initiated by Special Envoy Kofi Annan will actually result in a diplomatic
It was on February 2012 that Kofi Annan was appointed UN Arab League Special Envoy to Syria in an attempt to stop the violence. A month later, his 6-point peace plan was submitted to the United Nations, traveling on the 24th of March to Moscow to secure strong Russian support for the effort. Point 2 of the plan, before any other steps could take place, demanded a ceasefire on the part of both the opposition fighters and the Syrian regime. But Kofi Annan should have been told, you are dealing with a third element, not two. A third force, void of national loyalty, distilled from 3 key players: Saudi Arabia, the UK, and the United States. The Annan plan isn't failing. It is under attack.
When you see a lot of money in Syria, then I believe that Saudis.
تشهده سوريا الآن أساسا
هو مشروعا أمنيا عسكريا، يعني بمعنى أدوات عسكرية بطابع أمني. أدوات عسكرية بطابع أمني، يعني كل هذا الطيف الذي تشهده سوريا هو أدوات عسكرية لكنه بطابع أمني استخباراتي.
هذا نظام ما بيهمه لا العالم ولا أي شيء، يعني الموضوع أكبر من موضوع النظام. ليه؟ لأنه النظام مدعوم أصلا دوليا ومدعوم من قبل إسرائيل أصلا.
We are completely against arming the uprising, as well as we are against foreign intervention. We declare that very clear, very loud.
Left unspoken by the British and Obama administration anti-Syrian regime chorus is the fact that their highly praised Gulf partner, the monarchical government of Saudi Arabia, not only has expressed the desire to arm the rebellion, but desire a Libya repeat. Few have exposed or accused not only that they intended, but already are and in fact have been funding terrorist networks now said to have infiltrated the region before the uprising ever occurred, to the tune of $500 billion a year. Left unspoken, not out of ignorance, but out of an unofficial commitment to a global imperial agenda in place since September 11th, 2001.
I want to welcome His Majesty King Abdullah to the White House.
إذا علم أنه سيصل إلى هؤلاء وصولا جيدا بأمانة ودقة، فلا شك إن شاء الله أنه جهاد في سبيل الله، لأن ما قوى شوكة هؤلاء وأضعف شوكة هؤلاء مطلوب شرعا.
During the uprising, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf neighbors said to be hiring mercenaries to operate in Syria have since established refugee camps within Turkey's borders. Through their Islamic Relief Agency and with Saudi Army medical staff, they have been operating these camps with assistance by Turkish authorities. What goes on inside these camps? Almost no one can verify. International organizations are not allowed to enter them as they are prevented by Turkish authorities. The argument is that the refugees are not under refugee status. They are guests, and therefore not covered by international refugee conventions. What goes on within these camps, therefore, is the business of the Saudis, some Turks, their guests, no one else. In the same day, the Saudi Arabia's Grand Mufti, Al-Ashik, preached jihad for sake of Allah against the Syrian government. King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, in a meeting in Riyadh with his Jordanian counterpart, proposed negotiations with the Jordanian king to permit weapons shipments into Syria in exchange for economic assistance. Publicly, the exchange was said not to have been accepted, though a Jordanian official commented that the position was unlikely to remain, saying, "We are a non-interventionist country, but if it becomes force majeure, you have to join."
Well, I think that it is pretty clear that the rebels have been receiving arms from abroad, and Syrian television has been showing almost daily shipments of arms being smuggled into Syria via Lebanon, Turkey, and other border crossings.
نحن منذ البداية رفضنا التدخل في الشأن الداخلي لسوريا، لأن التدخل السوري والتدخل الخارجي في الشؤون السورية لن يخدم سوريا لا حكومة ولا شعبا. التدخل الخارجي سيزيد من تعقيد الأزمة. لذلك قلنا أن الحوار هو الحل الوحيد كمخرج للأزمة السورية. نحن عندما رأينا موقف روسيا كان موقفا حكيما، موقف الصين، لأن فعلا التدخل الخارجي، ولنا أمثلة كثيرة في المنطقة، عندنا أمثلة كثيرة في المنطقة. إلى أين أدى التدخل الخارجي العسكري في شؤون دول؟ هل أدى إلى الاستقرار؟ هل لغاية الآن في أفغانستان بعد مرور أكثر من 10 سنوات هل استتب الاستقرار والأمن في أفغانستان؟ أبدا. لنرى ما يجري في
Few have dared to come forward under the condition of anonymity, warning that the Saudis are beyond negotiations and public annunciations for jihad against Syria. They are in fact working behind the shadows they themselves cast to feed the conflict, sabotaging Annan's peace effort. A top Arab diplomat revealed in publications on March 17th that Saudi Arabia was in the process of delivering equipment to rebel fighters in an effort to militarily overpower the Syrian army. The weapons would be traveling through Jordan, where it was admitted later that Saudi King Abdullah in fact did discuss with the King of Jordan. Later, a Western diplomat in Ankara, Turkey, stepped forward and leaked that rebel fighters are being armed by Saudi Arabia and their Gulf state neighbor Qatar. The diplomat disclosed, though at first, anti-regime activists only smuggled small quantities of light weapons purchased on the black market in Hatay of southern Turkey and brought to Syria's Idlib province. As of late May 2012, the loose assortment of rebel groups had received multiple shipments of arms that included AK-47s, BKC machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and anti-tank weaponry from the monarchies of the Gulf. The weapons provided by Saudi Arabia and Qatar are going through Turkey, with Turkish intelligence units fully aware, as they are responsible for vetting who is eligible to receive arms and who is not. A vetting procedure that both U.S. officials and Arab intelligence officers have informed journalists that a small number of CIA officers in southern Turkey are similarly involved in, all intersecting the unverified activities of Saudi Arabia's Islamic Relief Camp and their guests.
The CIA has drawn up a plan to provide so-called moderate rebel groups in Syria with anti-aircraft weapons if the current ceasefire collapses. That is according to the Wall Street Journal's interviews with unnamed U.S. officials. They told the Journal that just before the cessation of hostilities took effect in February, there was a secret meeting of spy chiefs in the Middle East where the U.S. gave provisional assurances to its anti-Assad coalition partners that it would approve the delivery of more powerful weapons, of anti-aircraft weapons, to the rebels as Plan B. Plan A being, of course, getting a political process on track. That is what's happening in Geneva this week. This Wall Street Journal article comes out just before the UN-brokered talks resume. Russia believes that such a Plan B hurts the process because it sends a message to the rebels and their allies in the region that there may be a military solution, that they could get the weapons they want if they decided to fight on. Those really pushing for arming the rebels against Assad have been Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Over the years, they have funneled weapons into Syria, and because of the fluid lines between the so-called moderate rebels and extremists, many of the weapons ended up in the hands of terrorists like ISIL and al-Nusra.
في الحرية والديمقراطية وحقه في رسم مستقبله واختيار حكامه وفي التداول السلمي للسلطة، إدانة أعمال العنف والقتل وإيقاف نزيف الدم والتمسك بالحل السياسي والحوار الوطني ورفض التدخل الأجنبي في الأزمة السورية التي تعيشها الشعوب العربية المنطقة العربية. هنا أن يساهم في الحفاظ على أراضيها وسيادتها الإقليمية التي تعيشها الشعوب العربية.
لا أحد يريد الإضرار بسوريا، ونحن نعم مع فكرة تسليح المعارضة، التي تقاتل من أجل حريتها وحياتها.
تناقش وأيضا المنطقة العازلة هل ستناقش وهناك موضوع خلاف بين الطرفين؟
تروح تدخل بيننا خلاف وما في خلاف، هذا شيء ثاني. بس قلنا الدول النقاط الأربعة ايش بتقول؟ ايش بتقول النقاط الأربعة؟
اللي هي إيصال مساعدات ودعم غير مسلم، الدعم
غير ليثل.
اي طيب اللي يكون
هذا في أنظمتهم ماشي كذا، بس تسليح المعارضة واجب أعتقد، لأنه ما تقدر تدافع عن نفسها إلا بس للأسف.
Prince Saud Al Faisal's declared duty was followed with his Qatar partners hosting an announcement by businessmen in the Qatari capital, the creation of a $300 million fund for the rebellion. Though announced in June, Wael Mirza, one of the sponsors of the fund, admitted that the fund had been established long ago, for months, to, quote, support all components of the revolution. However, this figure is merely a drop in the bucket in comparison to the yearly $500 billion channel of money flows to overall Salafists and Al-Qaeda-linked groupings from the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. It is within this backdrop that Syrian expert in strategic affairs, Salim Harba, disclosed that the arrests of 700 gunmen in Bab al-Amr in early March were composed of gunmen from the Gulf states, Iraq, Lebanon, with Qatari intelligence agents among them. Salim said these men were stripped of weapons made in Europe, America, and Israel, including Israeli grenades, night binoculars, and communication systems. 60,000 rounds of ammunition were also confiscated in Lebanon around the same period, found hidden within 2 vehicles on board an Italian container ship. Intercepted in the Mediterranean Sea, like the seizure in Bab al-Amr, officials found rocket-propelled grenades and heavy caliber ammunition.
It's time for that regime to move on, and it is time to stop the killing of Syrian citizens by their own government.
Permanent members of the Security Council using their veto when people are being murdered, it is just despicable. And I ask, whose side are they on? They are clearly not on the side of the Syrian people.
Why has so much attention been given towards the Russians as the purveyors of injustice?
Russia is now being blamed in all crimes without any proof. Let's just take, for example, the attack on the humanitarian aid convoy. We know who hit it. It was one of the terror organizations on the ground. And we clearly know that the Americans are aware of this as well. But they prefer blaming Russia without proof. That's clearly not what can help the situation. This manner of acting at an international level is called pressuring and blackmailing. But with Russia, that has never worked and never will work.
What has stood in the way against the intended outcome of a global Black Ops operation has been the Russians and a minority of patriots within the United States. The desire is war. War because it is the only means by which the present international empire can maintain power as it deals with the harsh reality that its international financial system has reached an end. They would rather see a world engulfed by war, savage destruction, and famine than witness the rise of an alternative asserted through the powers of national sovereignty against the ancient rule of monetary law.
U.S. media reports say American and Russian fighter jets had a confrontation in Syrian airspace, highlighting a chaotic situation in which Russia and the U.S.-led coalition are bombing targets in support of different factions on the ground. Newsweek magazine reports at least 2 Russian bombers struck what the Pentagon described as a border garrison on Thursday near Jordan, which houses around 200 U.S.-supported rebels. The Los Angeles Times says the U.S. diverted its fighters to the area to stop the Russian planes.
Try to oppose the United States.
I want to be clear to those who wish to do us harm. I want to be clear to those around the world who want to destroy our way of life and that of our allies and friends. The United States military, despite all our challenges, despite our op-tempo, despite everything we've been doing, will stop you and we will beat you harder than you've ever been beaten before. Make no mistake about that. Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea went to school on us. They closely watched how we fought in '91 and '03. They studied our doctrine, our tactics, our equipment, our organization, our training, and our leadership. And in turn, they revised their own doctrines, and they are rapidly modernizing the militaries today to avoid our strengths in hopes of defeating us at some point in the future. Recently, a senior Russian official, ambassador to the United Kingdom, Alexander Karamenko, he said, quote, "The established world order is undergoing a foundational shakeup with the Crimea, Ukraine, and Brexit." He went on to call for the dismantling of NATO and the European Union. And he said, quote, "Russia can now fight a conventional war in Europe and win. Russia is the only country that will remain relevant forever. Any other country is dispensable, and that includes the United States. We are endgame now," end quote.
Russia's defense ministry has vowed to shoot down any perceived threat in Syria. It follows a wave of claims in the foreign press that the White House is considering direct airstrikes on Syrian army positions. Let's now discuss this with our RT's Daniel Hawkins, who joins me live from central Moscow. So, Daniel, tell us a bit more about this latest development.
It's quite a worrying and a serious development, Marina, I have to say. It follows a marked change in attitude from the Washington administration. John Kerry himself was actually in support of limited strikes against Assad back in 2013. He then switched to a more diplomatic outlook, and now it seems there has been yet another change of course. Washington, according to media sources at least, plans to hit Assad forces with strikes on the Syrian Air Force's airfields with cruise missiles and other long-range weapons. Now, this has understandably left the Russian Ministry of Defense quite concerned. They have personnel at the Khmeimim Air Base, the Tartus Naval Base, and indeed throughout Syria. Now, they've deployed a S-400 missile defense system. This is a defensive system designed to shoot down aerial targets such as cruise ballistic missiles and also airplanes and helicopters. Russia, of course, sees a grave threat to its personnel in these latest plans to target Assad's forces. And the Russian Ministry of Defense certainly didn't beat about the bush in warning of the consequences of such plans. Let's take a listen.
I would like to remind the American strategists that the air cover of the Russian bases in Khmeimim and Tartus is provided by the S-400 and S-300 anti-aircraft weapons systems, the strike radius of which may be a surprise to any unidentified flying objects. I should really acknowledge that the Russian anti-aircraft defenses won't likely have time to figure out through a direct line where the weapon's going or who it belongs to.
There's a risk associated with taking strikes at regime targets. That risk includes attacking a regime that does continue to maintain a robust air defense system. It also edges U.S. and Russian military forces closer to confrontation.
We know year by year what's going to happen, and they know we know. It's only you that they tell these fables and you buy it and spread it to the citizens of your countries. Your people do not feel a sense of the impending danger. This is what worries me. How do you not understand that the world is being pulled in an irreversible direction? That is the problem. But they pretend like nothing's going on. I don't even know how to get through to you people anymore.
Point of view that they're coming from.
How can soldiers kill other soldiers? This is impossible. Whatever media says this is plainly lying.
Speaking about fear, okay, I'll tell you one incident. We were supposed to interview one of the leaders of the National Coordination Council, the local opposition. The interview was set, And when we called him, he said, I might have to cancel because there were security forces, we think, who were at the office, and they wrote some threats on the wall. We had our fixer who translated what it meant. It said, you're working for Israel in the US, we're going to kill you. And so there were direct threats at the members of the NCC, particularly the leader. That was a scary time because they were just outside. We didn't know whether they would come in. And we asked our interviewee, are you scared? And he said, you only die once. So the Syrians are very, I felt, hospitable people. But when it comes to political talk, when it comes to expressing a political view in a crowd, it can really get heated. They would jostle. At the rally that we went to, it got pretty rough. Our camera was broken at some point. And, you know, but that is your job. You go in there, you try to do what you can. You try to film as much as you can, try to put it in as much context. And we had to sometimes tell people, please calm down. Otherwise, we can't get anything on film.
We're here in the center of the Syrian capital.
They stand as heroes, but in fact are our destroyers, operating behind the shadows of a grand scheme larger than the destruction they themselves conceive. The goal is imperial domination, and only few have risen against them. The goal is total control in a situation where their own cause is defeating them.
The world, stock prices fell like
the goal
dominoes.
Comes from no nation, but an outside force that has taken them hostage. Who their players are, we must know now if we are to defeat them. Yet the question remains, will we do so in time, before it becomes too late for yourselves, for your family, your children, and civilization? This is the true story of Syria.
Well, when we went to Syria, it was sometime in October, and the situation was getting very tense there. So our flight arrived at around 3 in the morning. So you can imagine the surprise and the shock of the security.
Where thousands have gathered to show their support for the government. Now, this is a far cry from the images we've been seeing in other cities in the country, where there have been reported clashes between security forces and anti-government protesters. However, one thing is clear, though, no matter where in this country.
Whenever there'd be news about Syria, or whenever we would be airing news about Syria, I would really pay attention and bother everybody here and say, I don't think that's correct, I don't think that's not as precise as I think it was. So I'd like to think that because of my trip there and my experience there, that when I see something about Syria, I don't take it at face value. I remember everything that I'd gathered and would look through it through that perspective rather than just what I see.
Overseas now to Syria, which today saw one of the largest demonstrations there in months. It's been a year of uprisings and violent crackdowns across the region, but the crisis in Syria continues without let-up, and today dozens more were killed. NBC's Ayman Mohyeddin is in neighboring Jordan and has our report.
9 months into the Syrian uprising, hundreds of thousands of Syrians took to the streets today, protesting a regime that shows no signs of backing down. In this year of the Arab Spring, a wave of change that toppled Hosni Mubarak of Egypt and Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, Bashar al-Assad of Syria has so far managed to hold on to power. The cost, more than 5,000 lives since March, With more killed each day, even as many soldiers defect, and the uprising lurches towards civil war. Nothing has slowed down the carnage.
Security forces, when 3 foreign journalists arrive at a time when there was a media ban, it's international journalists there.
Well, we're here in the center of the Syrian capital. You can see behind me traffic is just about starting to flow again. But
going into the city, Damascus was rather peaceful. It was quiet, although very tense still, because everybody knows what was going on in the country. And what's interesting, I think, mostly for us is that we saw the kind of diverse opinions on what was going on. There was no clear 2 sides even. There were more than 2 sides. It was not, I want the regime or I don't want the regime. And there was one time we were interviewing a young man, and he was rather critical of the government, so he gave his point of view. And what you didn't see on the camera is that there was a group of men around him and us listening to what he was saying. And afterwards, after the interview was finished, they all came up to us and said, "Get us on camera. We want to say what we feel." And then we also spoke to those people who were protesting, specifically those who were on the streets in Harasta. That's about 20 minutes outside of Damascus. One of the guys that we interviewed, he actually disappeared for 2 days, and he said he was held by security forces, he was beaten up.
After 48 hours of detention and torture, they took all of my money and belongings and threw me out into the street.
We also spoke with soldiers' families, those who had been killed, and you can also feel that they are angry at the protesters because their sons have been lost, their fathers have been lost, husbands have been lost, and you can understand.
Not even the presence of Arab League observers. Their job to ensure the Assad regime's compliance with an agreement aimed at ending the crackdown.
أيها الإخوة المسلمون في كل مكان السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته وبعد. أتوجه برسالة اليوم لأهلنا في شام الرباط والجهاد والعزة والعروبة والكرامة، شام الانتفاض على الذل، شام التصدي للظلم والظالمين، شام التضحية والفداء، شام الرفعة والإباء. فأقول لهم: سلام عليكم أيها الأحبة الأبطال، سلام عليكم أيها المجاهدون الآمرون بالمعروف والناهون عن المنكر، سلام عليكم أيها المظلومون.
Today, the government of Libya announced the death of Muammar Gaddafi. This marks the end of a long and painful chapter for the people of Libya. You have won your revolution, and now we will be a partner as you forge a future that provides dignity, freedom, and opportunity.
قولوا له بل أنت زعيم عصابة المجرمين، قولوا له لقد مضى عهد الإذلال وولى زمن الخداع.
I am confident that Assad's days are numbered.
The world will not waver. Assad must go.
We both agree that Assad needs to go.
It is just further evidence that Assad has to go.
He is no longer legitimate and that he needs to go.
For the sake of the Syrian people, the time has come for him to step aside.
Assad is on his way out. We all need to be thinking about the day after Assad.
Assad has lost all legitimacy.